In this video, I'd love to speak with you about autistic and ADHD, burnout and overwhelm. If that sounds like something you need some support with, then you're absolutely in the right place. I'm Nikki Butler, also known as the Autistic Joyologist, and I was diagnosed autistic and ADHD in my mid-40s. At the time of diagnosis, I was in the middle of running a successful skin and scar clinic, or I should say that was running me. And then prior to that, I had over a decade and a half of corporate experience. Now, my journey with burnout has been huge and varied. So because I was undiagnosed through my corporate career, when I hit a huge burnout at the age of 36, I thought it was corporate burnout, when actually on reflection, it was a huge autistic and ADHD burnout. I refer to that time as a catastrophic burnout because it saw the end of my corporate career. And when I look back, I can see that the signs were there for 18 months. I had, in fact, never found my corporate career easy. It was always incredibly overwhelming. I felt out of control, felt like a huge imposter. And it was inevitable that at some point, all of the plates I was spinning were going to come crashing down around me. But I wasn't really prepared for the impact of that burnout. And then prior to my diagnosis, I'd been running my own businesses for 8 years. And whilst that was much easier for me to control being self-employed, I was still experiencing what I would refer to as mini burnouts. And even before I was diagnosed, I started to notice that there were patterns a couple of times a year where I would really need to step back and take time to recover. What's really interesting for me now with my work as the Autistic Joyologist is people contact me and want to talk about recovery from burnout. And for me, having been through that multiple times, I think that really we need to flip this and start to look at preventing burnout and the steps that we can take to ensure we don't hit those catastrophic burnouts or the large, long episodes that have such a detrimental impact. Now, our burnouts are all going to be extremely different. And when somebody asked me to try and articulate and put into words how I experienced it, for me, it felt like somebody had tipped me upside down and shaken me and everything had fallen out. I had no energy, I had no sense of myself, I couldn't string a sentence together, I was so emotionally dysregulated. It was too much to even go into a supermarket and buy food because the sensory overwhelm of noise, lights, people, feeling disorientated environments meant I would often just run home and have a huge panic attack. And it took a year to recover from that burnout. And after that recovery, I'd lost my confidence, I'd lost my sense of self, and found that when it came to dipping my toe back into the work environment, I knew I couldn't go back to corporate, but I didn't have the trust in myself or the confidence in my abilities to do anything of any value or that was worthwhile. And I actually set businesses up that saw me earning less than £3 an hour, but had very, very little responsibility around them. So that was a really interesting period to go through. And I've spoken to many other women that have been in that situation during a corporate professional career that have felt like they've just got to the point they can't cope, have burnt out, never to return to those careers again, or to take demotions or lower positions, just believing that they weren't capable, not really understanding what was going on. And when I look at that then from a corporate point of view, leading into entrepreneurship, whilst the control came back as my confidence grew, around 3 years into running businesses, I started to gain some traction and work with coaches and put myself out there a bit more and increase my my brand and my earnings. But the confidence still wasn't truly there. And I was still coming into these episodes of burnout that were lasting 2 or 3 weeks at a time, where I again couldn't think straight. I would tell you I could hear electricity. You know, my senses were so overwhelmed. I couldn't communicate. I couldn't hold a conversation. I couldn't be in the presence of other people. And when I was diagnosed, it gave me a different lens to look at that through. And I started to think about how I'd arrived at those points. And the recovery was always difficult and clunky, and I'm not entirely sure I ever fully recovered from those episodes. And the focus very much became on looking at my life and looking at ways to reduce the risk and potential for burnout. And I know that can sound really challenging, really difficult, especially when we've got really busy lives that are going on, but I do believe that that's so essential to start to make the changes wherever you can. And understanding and recognising your early signs of burnout give you the opportunity to pull back and make some adjustments, whether that's asking for help in areas that you could use some support with, whether it's saying no to social events or to taking on additional work, or being able to renegotiate a deadline that you're working on, whether it's taking more time to be able to regulate how your nervous system is, so time with things like weighted blankets or listening to music that's soothing or something that helps you to regain that sense of balance and calm in your life. Because when you start to see your early signs of overwhelm and burnout, it's much easier to take care of yourself from that space than it is to keep going. And mark my words, burnout and overwhelm are going to find you if you don't stop. You know, we can't ignore it. If we choose to ignore the early signs, the burnout's going to come. You're not going to escape it. You're not going to find a way around it. The really powerful thing is to be able to recognise the early signs and to give yourself some grace and support to stop that going into a much larger overwhelm and burnout. So that's always my first bit of advice. Get to notice what those early signs might be. Maybe it's that you have sensory overwhelm, or you start to notice things. So for example, maybe the lights seem brighter, something seems noisier, you can hear electricity buzzing. You find that when you're going into supermarkets, it feels quite overwhelming. So that sensory processing is becoming really difficult. Maybe you're more withdrawn from other people in your life. You don't want to hold the conversations, or you're snappy, or you just want to be left alone. Maybe that you're exhausted, that physically you just can't seem to find the energy to get up and do anything, but you keep pushing yourself anyway. Have a think about little things that you might start to be able to notice. And here's a piece of advice that really has helped me. I have a weekly check-in with myself. So if I'm busy running through my week, trying to get as much done as possible, you know, flitting between one task and another, I do try and have a weekly check-in where I ask myself, how are you feeling right now? What's gone well this week? What's been challenging? Like, you know, what are you struggling with? Do you need some help? These questions, if you almost have a mini meeting with yourself, think of it, whether it's a business meeting with a work colleague, or, you know, somebody that you might have as an accountability partner. Think about having that as a meeting scheduled in your diary where you're literally checking in with yourself, because that might just be what you need to help catch those early signs. And then taking the time to be able to recover. So whatever helps to nurture you, whether it's time in nature, time to relax, peace and quiet, reading, think about what brings you back to a place of calm and feeling safe, and to re-regulate your nervous system and your well-being. But then what's really important is to start to look for the opportunities to make some change. So rather than just going back into exactly what you were doing before, when you start to notice the early triggers and the early signs, think about maybe what's causing that. Are you taking on too much work? Are you somebody that finds it really difficult to say no? So you perhaps take on another work project, you bring a deadline forward, you take on more tasks or help somebody out. You might be agreeing to social events that you really don't have capacity for. Those are your opportunities to make some changes. So to start to put some boundaries in place and be aware of the early signs, your limits, and being able to say no thank you, I can't come to the social event, or, you know, I'd love to help you on that project, but these are the timescales I can work towards. Thinking about those small tweaks and changes that you can then use to progress forward. And all of those tiny changes can help build up to avoid the overwhelm and burnout in the first place. And so for me, when I think about one of the biggest things that have impacted how I feel in my life, it's up there with, you know, one of the most important, of being able to know what causes me to feel overwhelmed and stressed, and therefore pushing me further towards burnout. How do I stop that in its tracks? What can I do to re-regulate myself? And then what actions can I take to change my life in certain ways, or to put boundaries in place that then stop that being a cycle, a repeat cycle where the same events are triggering you each time, and you're having to recover, and it's almost this kind of loop. So perhaps there's an opportunity for you to look at that whole process of knowing the early signs, making some changes, and avoiding or minimising the risk of burnout, rather than the focus being on recovery. Really hope that you have found that helpful. If you would like to reach out, please feel free to comment on this video or contact me on my socials, or you can send an email directly to hello@autisticjoyologist.co.uk, and I will see you soon.